At 8,000 meters above sea level, the air is so thin your brain starts to misfire. Your vision narrows. Your thoughts slow down, and then out of the swirling snow, you see it. A shape in the ice, a person. Their jacket shredded by the wind, their face turned toward the sky, their body frozen in the position where they took their final breath. On Mount Everest, some climbers never come home. They stay on the mountain year after year, turning into grim signposts that everyone else has to walk past on the way to their dream. Today, we're not talking about summit photos or record times. We're talking about the people Everest never let go, the death zone, the stretch of the mountain above 8,000 meters, where there's only around 1/3 of the oxygen you get at sea level. Your body is literally dying the moment you enter it. Stay too long, make one bad decision, move too slowly, and the mountain keeps you. These are some of the most haunting stories from that place. Francys Arsentiev didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to make history. She was 40, a mom from Colorado, and together with her husband, Sergei, she set her sights on a brutal goal: be the first American woman to reach the top of Everest without using bottled oxygen. No extra air, no radios, no Sherpa team. Just the two of them in the highest mountain on Earth. The night before their summit attempt, far away from the ice and rock, their 11-year-old son had a nightmare. In his dream, two climbers were trapped high on a mountain and couldn't get down. He begged his mom not to go. But once you've trained, planned, sacrificed, and spent years chasing a dream like Everest, don't go is almost impossible to hear. The climb was torture. Above 8,000 meters, every step feels like you're sprinting underwater. Your lungs burn, your muscles scream, and your brain is slowly starving. Still, Francys and Sergei pushed higher. On May 22nd, at around 2:30 p.m., Francys finally stood on the summit of Everest. Top of the world, no oxygen tanks. She had done it, but they had broken one of the most important rules in high-altitude climbing: turnaround time. Most teams agree, if you're not heading down by around 2:00 p.m., you retreat summit or no summit. Afternoon storms are common. Visibility drops, temperatures crash, and your body has already been pushed to the limit. Francys and Sergei were late. The light was fading. The temperature plummeted. They started down. Somewhere on that descent, in the chaos of darkness and altitude and exhaustion, they became separated. Sergei somehow made it back to camp alone. Francys didn't. When the sun rose the next morning and she still hadn't returned, Sergei did the unthinkable. He grabbed oxygen and gear and went back up into the death zone to find his wife. He never came back. The next day, another climber spotted something in purple, lying in the snow not far below the summit. It was Francys. She had survived through the night in temperatures around minus 40 degrees Celsius, with hurricane-force winds tearing at her. The cold had destroyed her hands and feet. Worse, it had attacked her mind. At extreme hypothermia, your body gets so confused you feel like you're burning up. Some people start stripping off their clothes as they freeze to death. That's what happened to Francys. A British climber tried to help. He tried to dress her, move her, drag her to safety, but up there, in knee-deep snow and almost no oxygen, a human body becomes impossibly heavy. Her limbs were stiff, frozen into the position where she'd collapsed. He couldn't lift her, couldn't carry her, couldn't save her. He had to make an awful choice: stay and die with her, or leave and live. He left. Francys died on the mountain, and her body remained there for years, just off the main climbing route. Climbers started calling her Sleeping Beauty, because even in death, her face looked strangely calm, like she'd simply laid down to rest in the snow. Later, they found Sergei's body higher on the mountain. He had fallen while trying to reach her. 9 years after her death, that same British climber returned to Everest. He and a small team moved Francys from the route and wrapped her in an American flag, giving at least a small measure of dignity to a dream that had cost 2 lives. Further down the mountain, in a rocky little alcove known as Green Boots Cave, another story unfolded, one that made the whole world ask, what would you do? David Sharp was a quiet, determined British climber, 34 years old. No big sponsor, no large guided team, not a lot of backup. He wasn't new to high places, he'd climbed serious peaks before, but Everest had become his unfinished business. He had already tried and failed twice. Frostbite had turned him back once. The second time, he'd come within a few hundred meters of the top. The third attempt, he went almost alone. No personal Sherpa guiding him step by step. No radio constantly checking in. Just David, the mountain, and a plan to climb with minimal support and almost no extra oxygen. On the way up, other climbers saw him. He seemed tired but determined, moving slowly in the thin air. Some people think he reached the summit. No one knows for sure. What we do know is what happened on the way down. Exhausted, freezing, and starved of oxygen, David crawled into a shallow cave at around 8,500 meters, a spot already known for another body that had been there for years, wearing green boots. He sat there, arms wrapped around his knees, ice forming on his eyelashes. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees. He had been in the death zone too long. And then the parade started. Climbers on their summit push began passing the cave. The Turkish team found him first in the early hours of the morning. He was alive, but barely. They tried to help, offered oxygen, but he couldn't stand. High on the world's tallest mountain, with their own lives hanging by a thread, they made a call and continued down. More climbers came. A New Zealander, Sherpas, other teams. Some thought he was already dead. Some tried to talk to him. Some offered oxygen he refused. Over 30 climbers passed that cave while David was still alive. No one managed to take him down. By the time the last group checked on him, his face was darkened by frostbite. His mind and body were shutting down. Another climber stayed with him for as long as he could, listening to his breathing weaken in the thin air, before he had to walk away to save himself. David Sharp died there in Green Boots Cave, surrounded by ropes, crampons, and footsteps from people chasing the same dream. His death raised a brutal question. On Everest, where just standing upright can feel impossible, how much are you morally responsible for another human life? Most people watching from sea level said, you help, no matter what. But up there, where every movement threatens to kill you, the answer gets much more complicated. Years earlier, another climber became a landmark on Everest one people described almost like a ghost watching them go by. Hannelore Schmatz was 39, an experienced German mountaineer who had climbed big peaks with her husband before. In 1979, they joined an expedition to Everest. Her husband reached the summit first and came back down. He warned her. The weather was turning. The wind was rising. It would be safer to wait. Hannelore went anyway. The wind slammed into the mountain like a freight train. Snow whipped across the ridges. Temperatures crashed to around minus 30 degrees Celsius. Still, Hannelore and others kept going, step after slow step, up into thinner and thinner air. She reached the summit in the afternoon. She'd done it. The highest point on Earth, but summiting is only half the climb. On the descent, she and an American climber, along with Sherpa guides, slowed down. They were exhausted and running low on oxygen. Night was coming. They were still in the death zone, where stopping can be a death sentence. The Sherpas urged them to keep moving. But Hannelore and the American were too weak. They made a terrible decision. They would bivouac, spend the night out in the open at nearly 8,500 meters. No tent, no shelter, just the wind, the dark, and the cold. By morning, the American climber was dead. Hannelore could barely stand. With help, she staggered downward. They managed only a short distance before she collapsed again, just a few hundred feet above the safety of Camp 4. Her last words were simple: water, water, then she died. Her Sherpa companion was forced to leave her body and go on alone. He survived, but lost most of his fingers and toes to frostbite. For years afterward, climbers reported seeing Hannelore's body beside the route, sitting upright against her backpack, hair moving in the wind, eyes seemingly open, watching people walk past. In a place that already feels unreal, she became a kind of legend. Eventually, a powerful storm swept her body off the ridge. She vanished into the lower slopes, never recovered. She was the first woman to die on Everest, but far from the last. In 1996, Everest reminded everyone that even the best guides and the most expensive teams are still fragile up there. Rob Hall was one of the top high-altitude guides in the world. A New Zealander, calm, experienced, and respected, with multiple successful Everest summits behind him. Scott Fischer, an American guide, was another big name on the mountain. Both led commercial expeditions, charging clients tens of thousands of dollars each for a shot at the summit. On May 10th, both teams went for the top on the same day. It was crowded, too many climbers, not enough fixed ropes in place, and not enough margin for error. Bottlenecks formed at a narrow rock step near the summit. Climbers stood still in the death zone, using up oxygen while waiting their turn to climb. Rob Hall had a rule. If his clients weren't on their way down by a set time in the early afternoon, he would turn them back. No mountain, no dream was worth dying for. But rules are easiest to follow from the safety of a warm room at sea level. On the mountain, with a client who had already failed once, who had invested everything into this attempt, turning around is not just a decision, it feels like betrayal. That day, those strict turnaround times blurred. One of Rob's clients, Doug Hansen, struggled on the way up. He moved slowly. His oxygen ran low. Everyone knew they were pushing the clock. Long after the safe time had passed, Doug finally reached the summit with Rob beside him. They took their victory far too late. As the two men began the descent, the worst happened. A sudden, violent storm blew in. Wind roared to hurricane strength. Snow erased the path. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Temperatures plunged to around minus 40 degrees Celsius. Climbers stumbled around in the dark, just a short distance from camp, unable to see it. Doug collapsed and couldn't move. Rob stayed with him, calling on the radio for help while the storm shredded any hope of an easy rescue. Other guides tried to reach them, but the mountain was a whiteout maze. Hours passed, oxygen ran out. Frozen air sank deeper into their lungs. By morning, Doug was gone. Rob was barely conscious. Rescuers made one desperate attempt to save him, even bringing him oxygen. But he was too weak to move, and the conditions were still deadly. In his final radio call, Rob spoke to his pregnant wife back in New Zealand. He told her he loved her. He told her to take care of their baby. Then the radio went silent. Rob died still clipped and high on the mountain, close to where he tried to protect his client. Elsewhere on the mountain that same day, Scott Fischer, exhausted from days of helping other climbers and weakened by illness, also collapsed and died in the storm. The 1996 disaster killed 8 people in a single climb, and it changed how the world saw Everest forever. The mountain wasn't just a bucket list adventure. It was a place where a small mistake, a little delay, or a single emotional decision could kill an entire team. Decades later, the dream of Everest still pulls people who don't grow up in the shadow of the mountain, but who see it on screens and in books and feel something ignite inside them. One of them was Shreeya Shah-Klorfine from Toronto. She was born in Nepal, raised in India, and later moved to Canada. When she was 9, she flew over the Himalayas in a helicopter and saw Everest from above. From that moment, she wanted to stand on it. Years later, as an adult, she decided to make that childhood dream real. She poured everything into it. She trained. She climbed. She borrowed huge amounts of money, even against her house, to pay for this one expedition. Around $100,000 for one shot. There were warning signs. Some people around her felt she wasn't fully prepared. Training had been rushed. She was often behind schedule. But Everest doesn't come with a big red "Are you sure?" button. It just waits. In May 2012, Shreeya left the final high camp along with a massive wave of other climbers. Hundreds of people were on the route. On the ridges and ropes above 8,000 meters, that's a nightmare scenario. Long lines formed in the death zone. Climbers waited in place, burning through oxygen, muscles shaking in the cold. The traffic jam cost energy and time that no one really had. Shreeya was slow. She fell behind the main groups. Guides urged caution. There was a turnaround time, as always. The mountain wouldn't care how much she had spent or how long she had dreamed. But when you've turned your entire life into one summit bid, giving up can feel worse than the risk of death. She kept going. Hours later, far past the safe time to head down, she stood at the top of the world with a Canadian flag in her hand and an oxygen mask on her face. She had done it. The dream that started when she was a child in a helicopter was right there under her boots. And then Everest asked for its price. On the way down, her pace collapsed. She had been climbing for nearly a full day. Her speech grew strange. She couldn't keep her balance. The Sherpas with her tried to help, pulling and supporting her as the storm winds grew stronger again. She went through bottle after bottle of oxygen, 8, 9. Her body was simply done. Eventually, she fell and couldn't rise. Shreeya died on the descent, not far from the climbing route, with the same flag she had carried to the top. Her husband traveled to Nepal to bring her home. She reached her dream, but the mountain took everything else. In 2024, Everest reminded the world that even now, with better gear, more information, and decades of experience, the death zone still doesn't negotiate. Joshua Cheruiyot was a 40-year-old banker from Kenya, but that job title doesn't tell the real story. The real story is he was a machine in the mountains. He had climbed Mount Kenyan more than 20 times. He'd gone up Mount Kilimanjaro in a time that would destroy most people. He had already summited another of the world's highest peaks without oxygen, becoming the first African to do so. Everest was the final boss. Joshua wasn't just aiming for a summit. He wanted to become the first African to climb Everest without bottled oxygen. Less than 2% of Everest climbers ever do that. Most people need supplemental oxygen just to stay conscious up there. Joshua wanted to do it the hard way. He had a Sherpa guide with him, carrying an emergency oxygen bottle and clear rules. They would only use it if things went really bad. If he blacked out. If the weather turned nightmare level. Otherwise, he would push on with nothing but what his own lungs could pull from the air. On May 22nd, they left the last high camp, heading into the upper reaches of the mountain. Step by step, breath by breath, Joshua climbed toward the top without oxygen. At a place called Bishop Rock, just a short distance from the summit, only around 50 vertical meters below, something changed. Joshua's behavior grew strange. He became confused, stopped listening to advice, showed signs of severe altitude sickness, the kind that whispers lies in your ear and tells you you're fine right up until your body crumples. His Sherpa tried to give him the emergency oxygen. Joshua refused. Imagine that moment. You are maybe an hour away from becoming the first person from your entire continent to do what almost no one does: stand on the summit of Everest without oxygen. The summit is right there, close enough to touch. Your body is shutting down, but your dream is so close you can almost taste it. They lost radio contact not long after. Bad weather made rescue virtually impossible. Later, searchers found Joshua's body in a crevasse just below Bishop Rock. He had died practically within sight of the summit. His guide was never found. Joshua's family decided not to bring his body down. He had loved the mountains his whole life. They chose to let him rest where he fell. And then there's Scott Fischer, back in that brutal 1996 season. A world-class climber, famous for his strength at altitude and for pulling off difficult climbs without bottled oxygen. On Everest that spring, he was not just responsible for himself. He was leading paying clients, juggling logistics, weather patterns, and the emotions of people who had spent years of their lives and huge sums of money for this one shot. Before summit day, Scott had already spent energy rescuing and assisting others lower on the mountain. He was exhausted before he even stepped into the death zone, but guides often put themselves last. The clients come first, the goal comes first, the image of being strong and unshakable comes first. As his team pushed upward into the crowds and the delays near the top, Scott grew slower. The thin air gnawed at him. He was falling behind, but he kept encouraging others to go on. By the time his team tagged the summit and began descending, they were late. The mountain's tolerance for lateness was about to run out. The storm that trapped Rob Paul's team slammed into Scott's group as well. Visibility dropped. Wind screamed. Gloves and goggles iced over. People could barely see their own boots. Scott's strength finally failed. He could no longer keep up with the people he was supposed to guide. He told his Sherpa to help the clients, to get them down, to focus on the living. He stayed behind in the storm. When rescuers made it to him, his jacket was open, his hands were bare, his oxygen mask still on his face, but his bottle empty. Like others before him, the cold and lack of oxygen had twisted his brain, convincing him he was hot while he was freezing to death. Scott Fischer never left the mountain either. His body was later moved away from the main route, but he remains there, another reminder that expertise, money, and reputation mean nothing to the jet stream winds and thin air at the roof of the world. It's easy, from the safety of a screen, to look at these stories and just see bad decisions. They clung too late. They said no to oxygen. They pushed through warning signs. They stayed with a client. They chased a dream too hard. But that's only one way to see it. You can also see love a husband refusing to give up on his wife. Loyalty a guide staying with his client until the end. Obsession a dream carried from childhood into adulthood, no matter the cost. An ambition someone trying to push what's possible for people from their country, their continent, their world. Everest is a giant mirror. It reflects our best qualities: courage, perseverance, discipline. And it magnifies our worst pride, denial, and the inability to walk away. The mountain doesn't kill with malice. There's no evil spirit guarding the summit. There is just physics, weather, and the limits of the human body. Yet the path to the top is lined with people who wanted it so badly that they stayed too long in a place where no human being is meant to live. Every year, more climbers step around the bodies and keep going, trying to prove something to themselves, to the world. Or to that 9-year-old kid inside them who once looked at a far peak and thought, one day, that will be me. The question isn't only why they went. The question is, what are you climbing toward in your own life? What dream are you chasing so hard that you might ignore the warning signs? What turnaround time are you blowing past because the summit feels too close to abandon? Everest is just one mountain, but the death zone pushing past your limits, denying reality, refusing to turn back exists in a lot of places far below the snow. On the roof of the world, the cost is just easier to see.